As the moon casts its pale light over the desert sands, an ancient terror stirs beneath the surface, one that has haunted the shadows of Egyptian mythology for millennia. This terror is not merely a legend or a whispered fear, but a living force, still echoing through time. In a world where the line between life and death was as fragile as a heartbeat, the ancient Egyptians crafted creatures not only of darkness, but of cosmic necessity. These beings were guardians and destroyers, embodiments of forces beyond human comprehension. In the quiet of the night, their stories come alive again, stirring a primal fear that lingers just beyond the veil of understanding.
In the quiet, shadowy hours of the night, as the world drifts toward sleep, there lies a question that echoes through the vast, timeless halls of history. What if the nightmares of the ancient Egyptians were not mere figments of imagination, but something more real, something that still lingers in the darkness of our collective fear? It's a question that invites curiosity, fear, and wonder all at once. To explore the terrifying creatures that haunted the minds of one of the world's oldest civilizations is to venture into a realm where myth and reality converge, where gods and monsters were no different, and where each was as capable of shaping the lives of mortals as they were stealing away their very souls. The ancient Egyptians, with their remarkable ability to weave tales of grandeur, painted a picture of a world filled with unimaginable dangers, often beyond the comprehension of the modern mind. Yet, despite the passage of thousands of years, the echoes of those ancient terrors still reverberate in the quiet corners of our minds. These are not stories just meant to entertain or frighten. They are warnings, allegories, and powerful manifestations of the Egyptians' relationship with death, the unknown, and the supernatural. Long before modern science began to unravel the mysteries of the natural world, the ancient Egyptians lived within a framework shaped by divine forces and monsters that could neither be reasoned with nor avoided. The belief in these creatures was not relegated to the occasional myth or ancient tale. It was central to their worldview. They saw the world as a delicate balance between the forces of order, represented by the gods, and the chaos, symbolized by the monsters that lurked in the shadows. In this environment, where life was fragile and the forces of nature could turn against you without warning, creatures of unimaginable horror were not just figments of fantasy. They were part of the fabric of existence itself. These were not the monsters of children's stories, waiting to be defeated in the end by the brave hero. No, these were beings that represented the forces beyond human control, forces that could not be understood, defeated, or even truly comprehended. The Egyptian, however, did not simply fear these monsters. They revered them. There was a profound recognition that such creatures, though terrifying, were also integral to the cycle of life and death. The same creatures that could destroy were often the same ones that helped maintain the cosmic balance, ensuring that life continued in the eternal flow of the Nile, that the sun rose each day, and that the dead made their journey safely to the afterlife. It's a concept that feels strange to us today, where we draw a clear line between good and evil, between protectors and predators. But for the ancient Egyptians, the very idea of duality was not as rigid. The monsters they feared could be seen as protectors, guardians, and even necessary evils in a world where nothing was ever truly black or white. The creatures of Egypt's mythological landscape were more than just nightmares. They were symbols of the forces that govern the universe. Take, for example, the concept of the desert. The desert was not simply an empty expanse. It was a powerful, almost living entity that the Egyptians both feared and respected. It was a place where the boundary between the living and the dead blurred, a place where the forces of chaos and disorder held sway. The desert was a home of gods and demons alike, where supernatural creatures could emerge from the sand and dust to claim the souls of those who dared to enter. For the ancient Egyptians, the desert was both a literal and metaphorical threshold, one that separated the world of the living from the afterlife. It was a place where the monsters lived, waiting patiently to cross over into the world of mortals. But this isn't to say that these monsters were always associated with death and destruction. In fact, some of the most terrifying creatures of Egyptian mythology were not malicious in intent, but served important roles in the grand design of the universe. These creatures, much like the gods, were powerful beings that could either create or destroy, depending on their will. For example, the serpent was one of the most feared creatures in Egyptian mythology, a symbol of both death and rebirth. It was said that the serpent's venom could kill, but that the serpent also represented the transformative power of the underworld, where the dead would be reborn into the afterlife. It is here, in this murky space between creation and destruction that we find some of the most terrifying creatures in Egyptian mythology. These were not merely physical beings. They were manifestations of fear itself, taking shape as creatures that existed on the borders of human understanding. In ancient Egypt, monsters didn't have the luxury of being confined to one category. Some were seen as protectors of the afterlife, fierce creatures who ensured that only the worthy could pass through the gates of the underworld. Others were agents of chaos, embodiments of the eternal struggle between order and disorder, life and death. It was not unusual for these creatures to exist in a state of constant tension. Sometimes they were allies, sometimes they were enemies, but in the end, they were all part of the same eternal cycle. It's important to understand, too, that these creatures were never entirely separate from the human experience. The ancient Egyptians saw their world as a place where the divine and the mortal were intertwined, where the gods and monsters interacted with the human realm on a daily basis. Every day, the living would interact with representations of these creatures through statues, rituals, and offerings. These monsters were not relegated to stories told around the fire at night. They were present in every corner of Egyptian life, from the sacred tombs of pharaohs to the bustling markets of the Nile. What is perhaps most fascinating, though, is the Egyptians' view of death itself. To them, death was not something to be feared. It was simply another part of the cycle. But this was a cycle that had its dangers, and one of the greatest dangers was the judgment that came after death. The Egyptians believed that when a soul crossed into the afterlife, it would be weighed against the feather of Ammit, the goddess of truth and order. If the heart of the deceased was found wanting, it would be devoured by a monster of terrifying proportions. This monster, known as Ammit, was a creature that could not be reasoned with, a terrifying amalgamation of crocodile, hippopotamus, and lion. The prospect of facing Ammit in the afterlife was perhaps the greatest fear of the ancient Egyptians, for it was a fate worse than death itself. It's this sense of inevitable terror, this idea that monsters were as much a part of life as they were a part of death, that sets Egyptian mythology apart from others. These creatures were not simply imagined fears. They were real and tangible entities that shaped the very lives of the people. Every creature, every god, every demon had its place in the cosmic order, and it was up to the living to understand their place within that order. As we journey deeper into the terrifying monsters of ancient Egypt, we will uncover stories that have survived for millennia, stories that continue to send shivers down the spine. These creatures, whether they were protectors, agents of chaos, or embodiments of the unknown, still have the power to disturb and fascinate us. Their legacy endures, not only in the tombs and hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt, but also in the very fabric of our collective consciousness. And as we look back to those ancient times, we must remember that the monsters of Egypt were not merely figures of fear. They were reflections of the human condition itself. Our deepest fears, our most profound uncertainties, and our ongoing struggle to understand the forces that govern our world. In the darkness, both ancient and modern, they are still there, watching, waiting, reminding us that the line between the living and the dead, the real and the imagined, is far thinner than we care to believe. The ancient Egyptian world was one in which the boundaries between the seen and unseen were not just blurred but intimately interwoven. Their daily lives were marked by rituals, beliefs, and practices that placed the divine in every corner of existence. What we might consider a mere mythological tale was, to them, a reflection of universal truths, a world where gods, spirits, and terrifying creatures ruled not only the distant realm of the afterlife, but also the streets, homes, and tombs of the living. For the ancient Egyptians, there was no distinction between the supernatural and the natural. They lived in a universe where the forces of the divine, the human, and the monstrous interacted continuously, shaping the course of their lives and determining their ultimate fates. The Egyptian cosmos was founded on the principle of Ma'at, which represented order, balance, and harmony. This was the very foundation of their worldview. Ma'at was not just a concept. It was the cosmic law that governed the universe. It was a force that kept the stars in their courses, the sun rising each day, and the Nile flooding its banks in time with the seasons. The gods, who were believed to be the living manifestations of Ma'at, were deeply involved in ensuring that order prevailed. But Ma'at was not a passive force. It had to be constantly maintained through the proper rituals, offerings, and, most importantly, by maintaining harmony between the forces of nature and the gods. This is where the terrifying creatures of ancient Egypt came into play, beasts and demons that were not merely imagined fears, but forces that served as guardians, enforcers, and manifestations of chaos, the opposite of Ma'at. Egyptian mythology, with its richly detailed pantheon of gods and spirits, presents a complex landscape where these monstrous entities existed not as enemies of the gods, but as necessary counterparts in the eternal struggle to maintain balance. These creatures were part of a larger tapestry in which the natural world and the divine intersected, each playing a crucial role in the larger story of existence. From the moment the ancient Egyptians began to form their identity as a civilization, they saw the world around them as a place where invisible forces had profound and tangible effects. The divine was not simply a distant abstract concept. It was something to be felt in every gust of wind, every ripple of the Nile, every grain of sand beneath their feet. In this context, the monsters of Egypt were not mere symbols of irrational fear. They were representations of the darker forces that existed in the world. They were the embodiment of the chaos that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance of Ma'at. Unlike in modern mythologies, where monsters are often depicted as purely evil beings to be defeated by a hero, the monsters of ancient Egypt had roles that were far more complex. They represented an essential part of the cosmic cycle, the inevitable return of disorder and destruction that would, in turn, lead to the restoration of order. This constant ebb and flow of creation and destruction was seen as a necessary condition for life to continue. Without chaos, there could be no renewal. Without monsters, there could be no heroes. The ancient Egyptians lived their lives in constant interaction with these unseen forces. The gods were not remote entities that lived in a distant heaven. They were present in every aspect of daily life, guiding and protecting the people, or in some cases, imposing their will with terrifying consequences. The monsters, too, were never far away. They were visible in the very geography of Egypt. The desert, vast and untamed, represented the forces of chaos. It was a place where the divine and the demonic could emerge unexpectedly, where both gods and monsters could manifest at any time. The desert was a realm of danger, but also of great power and potential. The endless expanse of sand and rock held secrets, both ancient and hidden, that the Egyptians believed could only be unlocked by those who understood the language of the gods and monsters. In Egyptian culture, there was no singular, otherworldly realm where monsters dwelled. Instead, the divine and the monstrous could manifest in various places, from the sacred tombs of the dead to the depths of the Nile River, and from the dark corners of the temple to the stark isolation of the desert. The Nile itself, while a source of life and fertility, was also home to creatures that could strike fear into the hearts of the Egyptians. The crocodile, the serpent, and the hippopotamus were just some of the creatures that haunted the banks of the Nile. These animals, while revered for their power, were also seen as dangerous and unpredictable. In fact, the creatures that live in the Nile were often associated with gods and spirits that could both nurture and destroy, depending on their mood. In the Egyptian belief system, monsters were not simply figments of imagination. They were real and tangible representations of the forces that governed the world. These were beings that did not respect human boundaries or limitations. They could not be controlled by human will or appeased by mere offerings. Unlike the gods, who were believed to be benevolent and responsive to rituals, the monsters of Egypt were capricious and untamed. They were forces of nature that represented a fundamental and unavoidable part of life, the ever-present threat of chaos and destruction that could break through the veil of order at any moment. To understand the terrifying creatures of Egyptian mythology is to grasp the fundamental way in which the Egyptians viewed the universe. Their world was not one of neat divisions, where light and dark, good and evil, and life and death existed as separate, easily understood categories. Instead, these forces were intertwined, constantly shifting, and each capable of transforming into its opposite. Life could give way to death, but death was not an end. It was a continuation of the cycle. Similarly, the forces of order could easily be disrupted by the forces of chaos, and chaos, while destructive, could eventually lead to the renewal of life. This worldview was expressed in the terrifying creatures that the Egyptians believed inhabited their world. Some of these creatures were believed to be physical manifestations of the gods, while others were seen as divine agents of destruction. The very idea of monsters, in this context, was inseparable from the divine order of the cosmos. The gods created monsters to maintain balance, and monsters, in turn, upheld the gods by ensuring that chaos never fully overcame the forces of order. To the ancient Egyptians, the fear of these monsters was not a purely emotional response. It was an intellectual and spiritual recognition of the fundamental nature of existence. Monsters were not just threats to be feared. They were necessary parts of the cosmic balance, essential for maintaining the structure of the universe. This duality is perhaps best exemplified by one of the most terrifying and famous creatures in Egyptian mythology, Ammit, the Devourer of souls. Ammit was a being that existed at the threshold between life and death, between order and chaos. Her role was to consume the souls of those who were found unworthy in the judgment of the dead. In this way, she embodied the destructive forces of the underworld, ensuring that only those who lived in accordance with Ma'at could pass into the afterlife. The idea that monsters, like gods, could both create and destroy was a constant theme in Egyptian mythology. The ancient Egyptians understood that life itself was a fragile thing, a delicate balance that could be tipped at any moment. Monsters were simply the physical and spiritual manifestations of this delicate balance, forces that served as reminders of the fragility of existence. To understand these creatures was to understand the very nature of life and death, and the ancient Egyptians believed that their continued survival depended on their ability to maintain that balance. This understanding of the world, where the divine and the monstrous were inseparable, gave rise to a deeply complex mythology. It was a mythology that did not see monsters as simply objects of fear, but as integral to the ongoing cycle of existence. They were the shadows that gave depth to the light, the necessary contrast that allowed the forces of Ma'at to hold sway over the universe. And in this, the monsters of ancient Egypt continue to captivate us today. They are not just remnants of a long-gone past. They are reminders of a time when the world was still mysterious and full of unseen forces. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the world seems still and full of shadows, it is not difficult to imagine that these ancient creatures are still watching, waiting, just beyond the veil of our understanding. The vast, inhospitable desert that stretches across much of Egypt's landscape was never just an empty expanse of sand and dust to the ancient Egyptians. To them, the desert was alive with both tangible and intangible forces. Its endless dunes and rocky outcrops were the domain of gods, spirits, and creatures that existed outside the grasp of ordinary human understanding. The desert represented more than just a geographical feature. It was a powerful and mysterious force, imbued with a sense of both awe and fear. It was a place where the rules of the mortal world seemed to break down, where time and space bent and shifted in ways that were difficult to comprehend. But more than anything, the desert was seen as a threshold, a boundary between the known world of the living and the mysterious, often terrifying realm of the divine and the monstrous. In Egyptian mythology, the desert was not just a physical barrier between civilization and the wilderness. It was also a spiritual and psychological barrier, separating the mundane from the supernatural. It was here, in the vast emptiness, that the ancient Egyptians believed monsters and gods could emerge at any moment, threatening to cross the line into the world of the living. The desert stillness and solitude invited both awe and dread, for it was a place where time seemed to stand still, yet also where the passage between life and death was most fragile. In Egyptian thought, the natural world was not separate from the divine realm, but interconnected with it. The gods were not relegated to an abstract, far-off heaven. They were deeply enmeshed in the life of the land itself. Every river, every hill, and every grain of sand held divine significance. The desert was particularly potent in this regard, for it represented the edge of human civilization, a wild, untamed space where familiar rules of the human world did not apply. As a result, it was in the desert that the forces of chaos were most strongly felt, and where the greatest threats to order and balance arose. It was a place where the divine and monstrous forces could cross over into the world of humans. The very essence of the desert was both life-giving and dangerous. It was where ancient Egyptians sought refuge and comfort, but also where they encountered the terrifying unknown. It was believed that the desert was populated by gods and spirits who dwelled in its barren corners, watching over the land and enforcing the will of the gods. One of the most important roles of the desert in Egyptian thought was as a place where the boundary between life and death was blurred. It was here that souls were said to pass from the world of the living into the afterlife, crossing the threshold into the realm of the dead. As the home of the dead, the desert was seen as a place of transition and transformation, where the soul would face judgment, either to be granted eternal life or condemned to eternal suffering. It was said that the desert was where monsters and spirits of the dead roamed, guardians of the underworld who ensured that only those deemed worthy could pass into the afterlife. These were not the gentle, protective figures that we might associate with angels or benign deities. Instead, they were fierce, terrifying beings that could devour the souls of the unworthy, dragging them into the dark, desolate realms of the dead. The ancient Egyptians believed that these creatures were not simply products of imagination or superstition. To them, these monsters were real and represented forces that operated beyond the comprehension of the human mind. The desert was a place where these forces were most strongly felt, where the veil between the living world and the afterlife was at its thinnest. It was a place where monsters lurked, hidden in the shadows, waiting to pounce on those who ventured too far into their domain. These monsters were often seen as divine agents, sent by the gods to protect the afterlife and maintain the cosmic order. Some of these creatures were said to be humanoid. Others were hybrid forms, combining animal features with human-like traits. In Egyptian art and literature, these creatures were depicted with a sense of awe, fear, and reverence. Fierce protectors, whose role was to ensure that the living did not disturb the sacred balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. But the desert was not only the home of guardians and protectors. It was also where chaos itself could emerge. The Egyptian understanding of the desert was not one of simple dichotomy, where order and chaos existed as separate entities. Instead, the desert was a place where both forces coexisted, and where the very nature of chaos was integral to the cycle of life. Just as the Nile's floods brought both life and destruction, the desert held within it the dual nature of creation and destruction. In Egyptian mythology, chaos was not an evil force that had to be eradicated. Rather, it was a necessary counterpart to order, a force that was as integral to existence as the sun was to the day. In this way, the monsters of the desert represented the untamable, uncontrollable aspects of the universe. They were a reminder that no matter how carefully human beings sought to maintain order and harmony, chaos could always rear its head and upset the balance. The fear of these creatures was not just a result of superstition, but of an understanding that the desert was a place where the boundaries between life and death, order and disorder, were fluid. The very unpredictability of the desert landscape, the way the wind could suddenly shift, the way the sand could form into great dunes or vast stretches of nothingness, mirrored the forces of chaos that were seen to reside there. It was in this shifting, unpredictable environment that the Egyptians believed the monsters of their mythology could emerge without warning. These monsters were not simply creatures of folklore. They were representations of the chaotic forces that could suddenly disrupt life, sweeping across the land and destroying all that was in its path. These creatures were as unpredictable and dangerous as the desert itself, capable of shifting forms and unpredictably appearing to threaten the unprepared traveler. At the same time, the ancient Egyptians understood that the desert's terrifying creatures were not just agents of destruction. They were also essential to the preservation of order. In Egyptian mythology, the desert and its creatures were not merely the embodiments of fear, but were necessary components of the cosmic balance. The Egyptians believed that in order for the cycle of life to continue, both the forces of creation and destruction had to be in constant motion. The monsters of the desert, then, were not just agents of chaos. They were also the guardians of life and death. Without them, the very concept of life, rebirth, and immortality would have been meaningless. They were, in a sense, the custodians of the universe's most important laws, ensuring that life and death, order and chaos, continued an eternal dance that could never be broken. The desert's role as a liminal space, a place where the normal rules of existence no longer applied, was reflected in the Egyptian belief that the souls of the dead traveled through it to reach their final destination in the afterlife. This journey was not a peaceful one. The souls of the dead had to face numerous trials, often in the form of terrifying creatures that guarded the gates to the afterlife. These creatures were seen as tests for the soul, ensuring that only those who lived justly and honorably would pass into the realm of the gods. It was here in the desert that these trials occurred, and where the forces of chaos and disorder could threaten to overwhelm the soul. The very idea of crossing the desert into the afterlife was fraught with danger, but it was also an essential part of the Egyptian worldview, a journey that would ultimately bring the soul into the presence of the gods, if it were found worthy. Thus, the desert was not just a physical place. It was a representation of the deeper, more existential struggles that defined the Egyptian understanding of life, death, and the afterlife. It was a space in which the forces of creation and destruction coexisted, where gods and monsters played out their roles in eternal cycle. To cross the desert, then, was to enter into a realm where the rules of the mortal world no longer applied, where life and death were in constant flux, and where the forces of chaos could emerge at any moment. In this way, the desert became a powerful symbol of the mysteries of the universe itself. Vast, mysterious, and filled with both wonder and terror, the ancient Egyptians, in their understanding of the desert, did not see it as a place to be feared, but as a place to be respected. It was a place where the gods and monsters could reveal themselves in their full power, a place where the forces of nature and the supernatural collided in ways that were both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The desert was not simply the home of the dead. It was a place where the very essence of existence could be understood, if only one had the courage to face its dangers. It was, in the end, a place of transformation, where life and death, chaos and order came together in a dance as old as time itself. The ancient Egyptians understood this, and it was through their deep respect for the desert and its inhabitants, both divine and monstrous, that they forged a civilization capable of surviving the most treacherous of landscapes. And even today, as we look upon the endless sands of Egypt, we are reminded of the timeless power of the desert and of the mysterious creatures that still haunt its vast, silent expanse. In the stillness of the afterlife, where the sun's relentless passage across the sky fades into eternal twilight, there waits one of the most terrifying and relentless figures in all of ancient Egyptian mythology, Ammit, the Devourer of souls. Her name alone strikes a chord of dread. She was not just a creature of myth. She embodied the deepest fears of the ancient Egyptians, a terrifying symbol of judgment and finality. For the Egyptians, death was not simply an end. It was a passage, a journey into the afterlife, where one's deeds in life would determine their fate. And it was Ammit who played the ultimate role in deciding whether that fate would be one of eternal peace or an endless, soul-consuming torment. Ammit, often depicted with the head of a crocodile, the body of a lioness, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, was a hybrid creature, one that was both divine and monstrous. She was neither fully god nor fully beast, and in this liminal space between the human and the divine, she embodied the harsh, unforgiving aspect of the ancient Egyptian view of the afterlife. The judgment of the dead was a momentous event, one that involved the weighing of the heart of the deceased against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, order, and justice. Ma'at was the foundation of Egyptian civilization, a principle that governed not only the natural world, but also the moral and spiritual realms. If the deceased's heart, which was believed to hold the essence of their life and deeds, was found to be heavier than the feather, it meant that the person had lived in opposition to Ma'at, that they had committed acts of wrong or immorality during their life. This was where Ammit came into play. If the heart weighed too much, if it was burdened with the weight of sin, then it would be cast into her jaws. There, the devourer of souls would consume it, and the soul of the deceased would be destroyed forever. The fate of those who were judged unworthy was not simply one of suffering or punishment. It was one of obliteration, of ceasing to exist entirely. The terror that Ammit inspired in the ancient Egyptians cannot be overstated. The idea that a soul could be devoured and erased from existence forever was the ultimate fear for the Egyptians. Death was not something to be feared. It was simply the next stage in the journey. But annihilation, the destruction of one's essence, the obliteration of a soul that had existed for all eternity, was the most terrible fate one could imagine. And Ammit was the embodiment of that fate, the final arbiter of judgment, a being who ensured that only the pure could pass into the afterlife, and that those who had lived in discord with Ma'at would face utter extinction. Ammit's role in Egyptian mythology, however, is not simply one of terror. She is a crucial figure in the cosmic balance, the necessary counterpoint to the forces of life and order. In the Egyptian worldview, the afterlife was not just a reward for good deeds, nor was it a place where the wicked could escape the consequences of their actions. It was a place where cosmic justice was upheld, where the weight of one's actions in life had real and lasting consequences. Ammit, as terrifying as she was also a necessary force to ensure that balance was maintained. Without her, the world would have fallen into disorder, for the existence of evil, or at least the possibility of evil, was an inescapable reality. The Egyptians understood this cosmic duality. There could be no light without darkness, no good without evil, no creation without destruction. In this sense, Ammit was not merely a monster, but a divine force that enforced the ultimate laws of the universe. Without her, the entire moral structure of Egyptian life would collapse. She ensured that only those who lived in accordance with Ma'at could pass into eternity, while those who failed would face annihilation, thereby maintaining the balance of order and chaos. The figure of Ammit also speaks to the ancient Egyptian concept of Ma'at as a deeply practical, everyday principle. To live in accordance with Ma'at was not just a matter of divine favor. It was essential for survival and prosperity. It governed not only religious and moral behavior, but also social and political systems. In a world where the gods were seen as direct influences on every aspect of life, the consequences of failing to uphold Ma'at were seen as inevitable. The idea of cosmic judgment, of being weighed against a feather of Ma'at, was not just a distant, abstract concept. It was an integral part of life itself. People were encouraged to live virtuously, to uphold justice, and to avoid causing harm to others. The fear of being devoured by Ammit was not merely a fear of the afterlife. It was a fear that permeated everyday existence, an ever-present reminder of the importance of living in harmony with the divine principles of order and truth. The image of Ammit, her fearsome hybrid form, her terrifying gaze, her insatiable hunger, was not just a product of religious imagination, but also a reflection of the ancient Egyptian understanding of the world. She embodied the harshness of nature itself, the unforgiving forces that could bring both life and destruction. In a world where the Nile could flood, bringing both life and death, where the desert could swallow whole cities and entire caravans, the Egyptians understood that the universe was a place of constant balance and conflict. Ammit, as a creature born of chaos and judgment, reflected the terrifying reality that the forces of destruction were always present, lurking just beneath the surface of the world. Her role in the afterlife served as a constant reminder that even in death, one could not escape the consequences of their actions. There was no peace, no eternal rest for those who had failed to live in accordance with Ma'at. There was only the terror of oblivion, the knowledge that one's soul will be consumed, erased from existence forever. In art and literature, Ammit is often depicted in terrifying detail. The grotesque combination of the crocodile, lioness, and hippopotamus creates an image that is both unsettling and awe-inspiring. Each of these animals in Egyptian mythology had their own associations with death and destruction. The crocodile, with its powerful jaws and swift, brutal strike, symbolized the danger of the Nile's waters, the ever-present threat of the river's violent floods. The lioness represented both strength and ferocity, a symbol of fierce protection, but also of uncontrollable rage. The hippopotamus, while seemingly placid in nature, was one of the most dangerous animals in Egypt, known for its violent tendencies and aggression. Together, these creatures formed a terrifying image of the all-consuming monster who could swallow the soul of the unworthy. But it was not just her physical form that was horrifying. It was her function in the afterlife that made her such a powerful symbol. She was an embodiment of finality, the irrevocable force that could undo everything a person had ever been. Ammit's presence in Egyptian funerary practices was significant, and she appeared frequently in tombs and burial texts. The Book of the Dead, the most famous funerary text in ancient Egypt, contained numerous references to her, reminding the deceased of the ultimate consequences of failing to pass the judgment of the gods. The Egyptians knew that the moment of judgment was inevitable, and they prepared for it meticulously. Spells, rituals, and invocations were all aimed at ensuring that the deceased would be able to pass to the halls of judgment unscathed, their hearts light and pure, ready to be welcomed into the afterlife. The image of Ammit loomed over this entire process, a reminder of what could happen if one's life had been tainted by sin or wrongdoing. In this way, Ammit serves as a symbol not only of terror, but also of moral responsibility. She was a guardian of cosmic justice, the enforcer of the laws that govern the universe. But she was also a force that reminded the living of the importance of leading a virtuous life, for the consequences of failing to do so were terrifyingly final. The Devourer of Souls, though a creature of horror, ultimately played a vital role in the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife, a role that was essential to the cosmic balance and the spiritual order of the universe. Without her, the very concept of the afterlife would lose its meaning, for it would be a world where all souls, no matter their deeds, would find peace. But the ancient Egyptians knew better. In their view, peace could only come after judgment, and judgment could only be just if it was accompanied by the possibility of destruction. The terror of Ammit, then, was not merely the terror of death, but the terror of facing the consequences of one's actions in life. It was the ultimate reckoning, the final reminder that life and death were not just physical states, but spiritual journeys fraught with consequences that reached far beyond the grave. And for the ancient Egyptians, Ammit's monstrous form was a powerful reminder that the price of failing to live in accordance with Ma'at was a fate worse than death itself. In the heart of Egypt's ancient landscapes, where the sun-drenched desert gives way to the life-giving Nile, there was an underlying belief in the ever-present, often terrifying possibility of chaos. The Egyptians viewed the forces of nature not as separate or passive, but as deeply intertwined with their beliefs about the divine, life, and death. Among the many powerful creatures in Egyptian mythology, one of the most formidable figures that embodied this chaos was the serpent, a creature of both death and renewal, symbolizing the dual nature of the world itself. Serpents were seen as symbols of immense power, capable of causing harm and destruction, but also of healing and transformation. The serpent represented something deeper than just a simple act of striking with venom. It was the embodiment of the universe's cyclical nature, where both creation and destruction were integral parts of the cosmic order. The serpent in Egyptian thought was more than just a creature of fear. It was a force of transformation. It was no accident that the serpent often appeared in the most sacred of spaces, from the royal crown of pharaohs to the thresholds of temples and tombs. The image of the serpent was often used to signify the powerful forces that govern both life and death. The gods themselves were frequently depicted with serpents, and these serpents were often seen as protectors of the sacred, guarding the divine against any threat. However, they also represented the constant, ever-present danger that the forces of chaos pose to the stability of the world. Much like the serpent's ability to strike without warning, the forces of destruction were always waiting to disrupt the harmony of the universe. Among the most well-known serpents in Egyptian mythology was Apophis, also known as Apep, the serpent god of chaos. Apophis was the embodiment of the primordial forces of disorder and destruction. He was believed to reside in the dark, shadowy waters of the primordial abyss from which all things came into being. His very existence was a constant threat to the sun god Ra, who represented the forces of order and creation. Every night, as Ra traveled to the underworld on his journey to rise again, he would have to confront Apophis, who sought to devour him and plunge the world into eternal darkness. Apophis' role in Egyptian mythology was not just that of a mere antagonist. He was a creature who represented the dark, destructive forces that could easily undo the work of creation. But he was also necessary to the maintenance of cosmic order. Without his constant attempt to consume the sun, there would be no need for Ra's daily battle against him, and thus the cycle of life, death, and rebirth would not be complete. In this way, Apophis was a necessary counterbalance, a reminder that creation and destruction must always coexist in order to maintain the balance of the universe. The battle between Ra and Apophis was not just a cosmic struggle between light and dark. It was a symbolic representation of the eternal conflict between order and chaos. It was a struggle that had to be fought every day, and it was only through persistence and strength of Ra, aided by his loyal followers, that the world remained in a state of balance. But this battle was not confined to the heavens or the realm of the gods. It was believed that the struggle between Ra and Apophis was played out on earth as well. The ancient Egyptians believed that chaos was an ever-present force. It was only through constant vigilance and ritual that they could maintain the order of the world. The serpent, in this context, was not just a symbol of fear. It was a symbol of the unpredictable forces of nature, forces that could either bring prosperity or destruction, depending on how they were understood and respected. The serpent's role in Egyptian mythology was also tied to the concept of transformation. The act of shedding its skin was a powerful metaphor for renewal and rebirth. In many ways, this symbolism reflected the cyclical nature of life and death that the Egyptians believed in so deeply. The shedding of skin was not an end, but a new beginning, a way for the serpent to cast off the old and emerge renewed. This symbolism was closely tied to the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife. Just as the serpent shed its skin to reveal something new, the soul was believed to undergo a transformation after death. The soul would shed its earthly form and pass into the afterlife, where it would be judged and either welcomed into eternity or cast into oblivion. In this way, the serpent was not only a symbol of death and destruction, but also of rebirth and renewal, reminding the ancient Egyptians that death was not the end, but a necessary part of the ongoing cycle of life. The snake also played a significant role in the symbolism surrounding the pharaohs. The uraeus, a serpent, was worn as a crown by pharaohs to represent their divine rule and protection. The snake, in this context, was not a symbol of fear alone, but also of the power and authority bestowed upon the ruler by the gods. The uraeus represented the pharaoh's role as the protector of Egypt, guarding against the forces of chaos that threatened the kingdom. The pharaoh was believed to be the earthly manifestation of the gods, and by wearing the uraeus, he was symbolically uniting the forces of order and power. But the serpent's presence also served as a reminder that the ruler's power was not absolute. Just as the serpent could strike without warning, so too could the forces of chaos rise up to challenge the pharaoh's rule. The snake was both a symbol of strength and vulnerability, a reminder that the pharaoh was subject to the same forces of destruction that governed the world. Beyond the immediate realm of the pharaohs, serpents were also present in Egyptian religious practices. Temples dedicated to gods such as Ra, Hathor, and Isis often featured serpents as symbols of divine protection. They were believed to guard the entrances to sacred spaces, ensuring that only the worthy could enter. The idea that serpents could protect and destroy simultaneously was central to their role in Egyptian thought. While they were feared for their ability to strike with lethal force, they were also respected for their wisdom and their connection to the divine forces that govern the cosmos. In some rituals, serpents were invoked as protectors against evil forces, their venom believed to have the power to purify and cleanse. In this sense, the serpent was both a destructive and regenerative force, a symbol of the constantly shifting balance between order and chaos, life and death. The association between serpents and death was further emphasized in the Egyptian underworld, where serpents were seen as guardians of the dead. The afterlife, known as the Duat, was a realm of both danger and possibility. It was a place where the soul would undergo various trials before being judged and either allowed to pass into eternity or condemned to destruction. Among the dangers of the Duat were the serpents that guarded its many gates. These serpents, often portrayed as fierce and unyielding, were believed to strike at those who were unworthy or who dared to challenge the gods. But, as with the serpents on earth, these creatures were also tied to the concept of transformation. In the Duat, a serpent's bite could either destroy the soul or lead to its eventual purification. Just as the serpent shed its skin to renew itself, so too could the soul shed its earthly sins in the afterlife, emerging reborn and purified. The serpent was not merely a creature of fear in Egyptian mythology. It was a symbol of the paradoxes and complexities of existence. It was a creature that could both create and destroy, protect and harm, guide and mislead. Its venom could bring death, but it could also heal. Its bite could be a sign of destruction, but it could also signal the beginning of a transformation. In this way, the serpent reflected the fundamental duality at the heart of Egyptian thought. The idea that life and death, order and chaos, creation and destruction were not opposing forces, but interdependent aspects of the same cosmic cycle. In modern times, the image of the serpent in Egyptian mythology continues to evoke a sense of awe and fear. Its role as a symbol of both danger and renewal speaks to the timeless human fascination with the forces that govern life and death. Just as the ancient Egyptians revered the serpent for its power and its mystery, so too do we today find ourselves captivated by its enduring symbolism. The serpent remains a creature of profound significance, not just in the context of ancient Egypt, but in cultures around the world. It is a creature that embodies the eternal struggle between life and death, chaos and order, destruction and renewal, a struggle that continues to shape the world we live in today. Deep within the ancient Egyptian psyche, a complex and often terrifying relationship with the divine and supernatural unfolded. The gods, spirits, and forces of nature were constantly interacting, intertwined with the lives of everyday Egyptians in ways both profound and terrifying. Among these forces, one of the most significant and fearsome creatures was a lioness, a symbol of strength, power, and fury, yet also a protector and a healer. The lioness, particularly in the form of the goddess Sekhmet, held a pivotal role in Egyptian mythology, embodying the paradoxical nature of both creation and destruction, life and death. Sekhmet was one of the most widely worshipped deities in ancient Egypt, known for her lioness head and her fierce, often terrifying demeanor. She was a goddess of war, healing, and destruction. Her dual nature, violent and nurturing, made her an incredibly powerful figure in Egyptian religion. As a warrior goddess, Sekhmet was believed to have been created by the sun god Ra to act as his enforcer, a fierce protector of order against the forces of chaos. But Sekhmet's anger, while directed at the enemies of Ra, was often uncontrollable. In some versions of the myth, she was unleashed on humanity, wreaking havoc upon the people with her destructive powers. She was so ruthless in her rage that the gods feared she would destroy all of mankind. To prevent total annihilation, they tricked Sekhmet by offering her beard dyed red to look like blood. In her drunken stupor, she ceased her rampage and returned to her role as a goddess of healing. The story of Sekhmet's rampage and her eventual pacification is a key part of understanding the complexities of Egyptian views on both violence and healing. Sekhmet was not just a goddess of destruction. She was also a goddess of restoration and balance. Her ability to both destroy and heal symbolized the Egyptians' understanding of life as a constant interplay of opposing forces. Life, in their view, was not a static state, but a dynamic balance between creation and destruction, between life-giving forces and those that could take it away. The Egyptians did not see destruction as inherently evil. Rather, it was a necessary part of the process of regeneration. Destruction, in the case of Sekhmet, was not an end but a transformation, making her one of the most multifaceted and revered figures in their mythology. The lioness, as a creature, was naturally associated with power and aggression. Its immense strength and hunting prowess made it a fitting symbol for Sekhmet, who was not only a fierce warrior but also a protector of the pharaoh and the land. The lioness was also a symbol of divine royalty and regality. In the case of Sekhmet, her lioness form represented both the strength to protect and the ferocity to punish. The lioness was not a passive symbol. It was a direct force of nature, a powerful embodiment of the natural world's inherent violence. The act of the lioness hunting, her unstoppable pursuit of prey, was mirrored in Sekhmet's role as the executioner of justice, the one who could unleash destruction when the cosmic order was threatened. But just as the lioness was both a killer and a mother, Sekhmet could bring death and life with equal intensity. Her anger and fury could lead to destruction, but she could also use her power to restore balance and bring healing. This duality is particularly important in understanding the Egyptians' conception of the divine and the supernatural. They saw the world as one where the forces of order, Ma'at, and chaos were in constant interaction. The gods themselves were not always benevolent and gentle figures. They could be fierce and vengeful when necessary. Sekhmet, in this sense, was a goddess who represented the darker, more aggressive side of the divine. She was the face of divine retribution, the one who could strike down the enemies of the gods and punish those who violated the natural order. But she was also a goddess of healing, restoring the sick and the wounded. Her connection to the natural world and its cycles of life and death made her a goddess who could both destroy and regenerate, and in doing so, she kept the balance of the universe intact. In the realm of the afterlife, Sekhmet's power was also invoked. The ancient Egyptians believed that the journey through the underworld, was fraught with dangers and challenges. There were numerous trials that the deceased had to face before they could enter the realm of the gods and be granted eternal life. One of the most terrifying aspects of the afterlife was the judgment of the soul, where the heart of the deceased would be weighed against a feather of Ma'at. Those who failed the judgment faced a grim fate, where their hearts would be devoured by Ammit, the fearsome devourer of souls. But even in the underworld, Sekhmet's presence was felt. She was invoked as a goddess of protection, ensuring that the soul was able to navigate the dangers of the afterlife. Her strength and power were seen as necessary for the soul's safe passage through the many trials of the do-it. Sekhmet's power also extended to protection of the pharaoh, the earthly embodiment of the divine. The pharaoh was seen as a ruler of both the land of the living and the realm of the dead. His role was to uphold Ma'at and maintain order in the world. In this role, the pharaoh was often depicted as the earthly counterpart to the gods, and Sekhmet, as a goddess of both war and healing, was called upon to protect the ruler from both earthly and supernatural threats. Sekhmet's image was commonly found in temples and tombs, serving as both a symbol of strength and a reminder of the divine protection bestowed upon the pharaoh. Her role as protector and warrior was intimately tied to the pharaoh's ability to maintain Ma'at and keep the forces of chaos at bay. Just as a lioness fiercely guarded her territory, Sekhmet fiercely guarded the land of Egypt, ensuring that it was kept safe from both human and supernatural enemies. Her presence in the temples and royal imagery was also a reminder of the pharaoh's connection to the gods and his divine right to rule. Sekhmet's image, often seen as a lioness or a woman with the head of a lioness, was a powerful symbol of both the fearsome might of the gods and the protective power that the pharaoh wielded. It was not just the pharaoh's physical might that was important, but his connection to the divine and his ability to call upon the gods for protection and guidance. Sekhmet's association with the pharaoh's divine authority was a reminder that the ruler's power was not merely earthly. It was supported and protected by the gods themselves. Yet, the lioness goddess was not always invoked solely for destructive or protective purposes. She was also a goddess of healing, a deity who could restore the sick and alleviate pain. Sekhmet's healing powers were invoked in times of illness, and she was believed to have the ability to cure disease and restore life. The Egyptians understood the duality of Sekhmet, recognizing that the same destructive forces that could bring about devastation could also be channeled for healing and restoration. The same fiery rage that could destroy enemies was also seen as capable of purging illness and cleansing the body. This healing aspect of Sekhmet's nature was a critical part of her role in Egyptian religion, showing that destruction and healing were not opposites but two sides of the same coin. Both forces were necessary for maintaining the balance of life. The Egyptians also believed that Sekhmet's power was connected to the sun god Ra. As a daughter of Ra, Sekhmet was deeply associated with the sun's life-giving and destructive properties. The sun, in Egyptian belief, was both a source of creation and a force capable of immense devastation. Ra, as the sun god, was the supreme creator, bringing light and life to the world. But Ra's power could also be destructive, scorching the earth and burning away everything in its path. In this way, Sekhmet, as Ra's daughter, inherited both the creator and destroyer aspects of sun. Her connection to Ra reinforced her role as a goddess who could both give life and take it away, whose power was as limitless and intense as the sun itself. Sekhmet's role in Egyptian mythology underscores a belief that the forces of the divine were not one-dimensional or static. The gods were complex and multifaceted, capable of both great creation and destruction. Sekhmet, in particular, embodied the idea that destruction was not inherently evil. Rather, it was a necessary force in the cycle of life. Her power was not just about violence and war, but about maintaining the cosmic order, upholding Ma'at, and ensuring the balance between life and death. Her dual nature, both destructive and healing, was a reflection of the world's constant state of flux, a world where chaos and order, creation and destruction were always in motion. In this way, Sekhmet was not just a goddess of war. She was a goddess of transformation, a symbol of the cycles that govern the universe and the eternal balance between opposing forces. The ancient Egyptian worldview was deeply intertwined with the understanding that the forces of life and death, creation and destruction, were not opposing, but complementary aspects of the universe. The gods were not distant abstract entities. They were powerful forces that actively shaped the natural world and human experience. Among the most potent and fearsome beings in this pantheon was Set, the god of chaos, disorder, and destruction. Set, whose name evokes both awe and terror, was an embodiment of the unpredictable forces that shaped not only the physical world, but also the spiritual and moral realms. His nature was complex, paradoxical, and ultimately essential to the Egyptians' understanding of balance and cosmic order. Set's role in Egyptian mythology was as ambiguous as his personality. He was both a protector and a destroyer, a god associated with chaos, but also with a necessary force that drove change. In Egyptian thought, chaos was not a purely negative force. It was a natural and inevitable part of the cosmic cycle. Set, as the god of chaos, was the instigator of conflict, the force that broke things apart. But it was through this destruction that new things could be created. The Egyptians understood that in order for life to continue, there had to be a continual cycle of creation and dissolution. Set was not merely a god of destruction, but also one who made transformation possible. Without Set, there could be no change, and without change, there could be no renewal or growth. In this sense, Set's role was both destructive and regenerative, ensuring that life would continue to evolve and adapt. Set's appearance in Egyptian art was as striking as his mythology. He was often depicted with the head of a strange, unidentifiable animal, known as the Set animal, which had a long, curved snout, erect ears, and a body that resembled a mixture of several creatures. This strange and unearthly appearance reflected his role as a god of the unknown and the chaotic. Set was not tied to any particular form. His very nature was fluid, capable of transforming and adapting to different circumstances. His inability to be defined by any one animal or symbol made him an unpredictable and mysterious figure. He was a god who existed on the fringes, on the borders of civilization and chaos, a figure who could both be a protector and a destroyer, depending on the circumstances. Set's complex nature was also reflected in his relationships with other gods. The most famous and significant of these relationships was his rivalry with Osiris, the god of life, death, and resurrection. Osiris was a central figure in Egyptian mythology, embodying order, fertility, and the afterlife. Set, on the other hand, represented the opposite forces, those that threatened to undo creation and plunge the world back into chaos. The myth of Osiris's death at the hands of Set is one of the most famous and tragic stories in Egyptian mythology. Set, driven by jealousy and the desire for power, murdered his brother Osiris and dismembered his body, scattering the pieces across Egypt. This act of violence was the ultimate representation of Set's chaotic nature, the destruction of order, and the attempt to throw the universe into disarray. However, Osiris's death and dismemberment were not the end. His wife, Isis, along with her sister Nephthys and other gods, searched for Osiris's body and reassembled him. Through their efforts, Osiris was resurrected, symbolizing the eternal cycle of death and rebirth, a cycle that Set's destructive forces could not entirely stop. Set's rivalry with Osiris is often interpreted as a symbol of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, life and death, creation and destruction. Set's act of murder was not just an attack on Osiris, but an attempt to disrupt the natural order of the world. Yet, in the end, Osiris's resurrection proved that even the most destructive forces could not undo the fundamental cycle of life and death that governed the universe. Set's violence and rage were essential to the mythology of resurrection, for they created the circumstances for Osiris's eventual rebirth. Without Set's destruction, there would have been no need for Osiris's resurrection, and thus no renewal of life. In this way, Set's role in the myth was paradoxical. He was both the source of destruction and the catalyst for rebirth. He represented the forces that tore things apart, but it was through this tearing apart that the world was able to be reformed and renewed. Set's role in Egyptian mythology was also deeply tied to the natural world. As the god of chaos in the desert, Set was often associated with the harsh, unpredictable forces of nature. The desert in ancient Egypt was seen as a place of disorder and chaos, a land that was inhospitable and dangerous. Set was believed to reside in this chaotic space, embodying the untamable forces of the wilderness. His dominion over the desert reflected his nature as a god who could not be controlled or contained. The desert was a place where the rules of civilization broke down, where the familiar boundaries of the world were erased. It was here that Set's power was most strongly felt, for the desert represented the forces of destruction and chaos that Set embodied. The desert was also a place of transition, a liminal space between civilization and the unknown, much like Set himself. In this sense, Set was not just a destroyer. He was a force that existed in the margins, in the spaces between life and death, order and chaos, creation and destruction. In addition to his association with the desert, Set was also a god of storms and the untamable forces of nature. His violent, chaotic energy was mirrored in the thunder and lightning that accompanied storms, phenomena that could bring both destruction and life-giving rain. In this way, Set's power was a reminder that nature's forces could not be easily controlled. The storm could destroy crops, homes, and lives, but it could also nourish the earth and bring fertility. Set's control over these stormy forces symbolizes his ability to shape the world, not in a predictable or ordered way, but in a way that was both terrifying and transformative. His storms were not simply chaotic forces to be feared. They were forces that could bring about change, shaping the world and the lives of the Egyptians in ways that were beyond their control. Despite his reputation as a god of chaos and destruction, Set was also considered protector in certain contexts. As a fierce and powerful deity, Set was invoked for protection in battle. The pharaohs, who were seen as the earthly representatives of the gods, often called upon Set for aid in times of war, particularly when they were fighting against foreign invaders. Set's strength and ferocity made him an ideal god to call upon in these situations. He was seen as a defender of Egypt's borders, a god who could drive back the forces of chaos that threatened the kingdom. In this context, Set's chaotic nature was harnessed for protection of Egypt, proving that even the most destructive forces could be put to use in the service of order. Set's ambivalence in Egyptian mythology highlights the complexity of the ancient Egyptians' understanding of the divine. Unlike many other cultures, the Egyptians did not view the gods as purely good or evil. The gods were multifaceted, representing both the creative and destructive forces that govern the universe. Set's role in Egyptian religion was to embody the destructive forces of chaos, but his destruction was not inherently evil. It was a necessary part of the cosmic cycle, ensuring that change and transformation could occur. Set was a god who tore things apart, but in doing so, he made way for the new. His chaotic energy was a reminder that the universe was in constant flux, and that creation and destruction were intertwined. Without Set, there could be no change, no evolution, no renewal. His role in Egyptian mythology, though terrifying, was essential to the balance of the universe. Set's place in Egyptian culture extended beyond religious texts and myths. He was a central figure in Egyptian royal iconography and was sometimes invoked during rituals and ceremonies. The pharaoh, as a representative of the divine on earth, often sought to emulate Set's power and strength, particularly when engaging in battles or conflicts. The ability to channel Set's power in the defense of Egypt was a sign of divine favor and strength. However, Set's power was not limitless, and it was always tempered by the understanding that chaos, in its rawest form, could also be destructive. The Egyptians understood that Set's influence had to be harnessed carefully, for while he was a god of immense power, his unchecked chaos could easily undo everything that the gods of order and stability had worked to create. Through Set, the ancient Egyptians explored the deeper questions of life, death, and the nature of the divine. He was both a symbol of destruction and a force for transformation, representing the complex interplay between chaos and order. His role in the pantheon was essential, for without his power, the world would have remained static, without growth or change. Set's mythology offered a way for the Egyptians to understand the unpredictable forces of nature and the universe, and his place in their culture highlighted the complexity of their view of the divine. Set was not merely a god of chaos. He was a god of transformation, a force that shaped the world in ways both terrible and necessary. His story was a reminder that life, in all its complexity, was not just a matter of good and evil, but a continual process of change, destruction, and renewal. In the realm of ancient Egyptian mythology, where gods and creatures held immense power over both the living and the dead, few figures embody both beauty and terror in equal measure as Hathor, the goddess of love, motherhood, and joy. Yet, while she is often depicted as a nurturing and maternal figure, her darker aspects reveal a complex and multifaceted character that was just as capable of destruction as she was a creation. Hathor's dual nature, both life-giving and fearsome, speaks to the ancient Egyptians' understanding of the delicate balance between light and darkness, creation and destruction, love and wrath. Her presence in Egyptian mythology reflects a deep recognition that all things, no matter how divine, possess both generative and destructive potential, and it was through this balance that the world itself was maintained. Hathor was one of the most popular deities in the Egyptian pantheon, widely worshipped as a goddess of fertility, love, music, dance, and motherhood. She was associated with the joy of life, the nurturing power of a mother, and the harmony of the cosmos. Often depicted with the head of a cow, or as a woman with cow's ears and a headdress adorned with a sun disk encircled by cow horns, Hathor's image symbolized both the gentleness of motherhood and the strength and fertility of nature. In Egyptian art and temples, Hathor was shown as a gracious and loving figure, a goddess who gave life to both the land and the people. Her role as a mother and protector was central to her identity, making her one of the most widely venerated deities in Egypt. Her influence extended to every facet of Egyptian life, from the well-being of the people to the prosperity of the kingdom itself. Yet, despite her nurturing qualities, Hathor's darker side was just as formidable. Known as the Eye of Ra, she was believed to be the embodiment of the wrath of the sun god Ra, and when angered, she could unleash her destructive power upon the world. In one of the most famous myths, Hathor, enraged by humanity's lack of reverence for Ra, transforms into Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess of war and destruction, and embarks on a terrifying rampage. In this form, Hathor, now Sekhmet, went on a bloodthirsty hunt, slaying the people of Egypt without mercy. The sun god Ra, seeing the destruction Hathor had wrought, feared for the world's survival and ordered that she be stopped. In an effort to calm her, Ra sent messengers to intoxicate Hathor with beer, which she mistook for blood. As she drank, her bloodlust faded, and she returned to her original, benevolent form, restoring peace to the land. This myth is often interpreted as a reflection of the ancient Egyptian view of the god's ability to both create and destroy, to embody both the nurturing and destructive aspects of nature itself. Hathor's role as the Eye of Ra connects her to the sun god's own complex nature. Ra, as the sun god, was a symbol of creation, light, and life. He brought order to the universe and ensured the stability of the world. However, Ra was also associated with the scorching heat of the sun, a force that could destroy as easily as it could give life. Hathor, as his eye, was the embodiment of this destructive aspect of Ra, the part of him that could wreak havoc on the world if angered. This duality is key to understanding Hathor's nature. She was both the giver of life and the bringer of death, a reminder that all things in the universe were interconnected and that creation and destruction were inseparable. Hathor's connection to death and destruction was not limited to her role as the Eye of Ra. She was also a goddess of the afterlife, particularly associated with the transition of the soul from life to death. As a protector of the deceased, Hathor was believed to guide the souls of the dead to the afterlife, ensuring their safe passage into the realm of the gods. In the tombs of the pharaohs, she was often depicted as a cow, symbolizing her nurturing and protective qualities, as well as her ability to give rebirth to the deceased. Hathor's role as a guide to the afterlife made her a vital figure in funerary rituals. Her nurturing presence was thought to offer comfort to the soul, ensuring that it was not lost or harmed on its journey to the other side. But Hathor's association with death also had a darker aspect. In her role as a goddess of destruction, she was believed to have the power to both nurture and annihilate. As the Eye of Ra, she was not just a protector but also a force of vengeance, capable of unleashing the full wrath of the sun god when necessary. This duality, her ability to nurture and to destroy, reflected the ancient Egyptian understanding of the cycles of life and death. For the Egyptians, death was not seen as an end, but as a necessary part of the eternal cycle of rebirth. Hathor, in both her benevolent and wrathful forms, was a goddess who helped maintain this balance between life and death, ensuring that both creation and destruction were honored and preserved. Hathor's presence in Egyptian religion was not limited to her mythological roles as a goddess of love and destruction. She was also a significant figure in the royal and political life of Egypt. The pharaoh, as the divine ruler of Egypt, was often depicted as the earthly counterpart to gods, and Hathor was seen as one of the most important deities associated with royal power. Her role as a goddess of fertility and motherhood made her an ideal protector of the king and his dynasty. The pharaoh's connection to Hathor was believed to ensure his legitimacy as ruler, as she was seen as a mother figure who nurtured and supported the king in his divine role. Hathor's influence was also evident in the ceremonial life of the court, where her presence was invoked during important rituals, especially those related to the king's coronation and the prosperity of the land. As a goddess who embodied both creation and destruction, Hathor was seen as a powerful force that could protect the king from both external threats and internal disorder, ensuring that Egypt remained strong and prosperous. Hathor's association with music and dance further illustrates her multifaceted nature. As the goddess of music, she was believed to bring joy and harmony to the world, inspiring artists, musicians, and dancers to create works of beauty and celebration. Her connection to music and dance was particularly important in religious rituals, where music played a central role in invoking the gods and ensuring divine favor. Hathor was often depicted playing a scepter in the form of a musical instrument, symbolizing her ability to bring joy and pleasure to the world. The music played in her honor was believed to have the power to heal, to calm the mind, and to connect the worshippers with the divine. Yet, even in her association with joy and music, there was an underlying sense of danger. Music, like all things, was a force that could both soothe and excite, bringing peace or chaos depending on how it was used. Hathor's connection to music and dance therefore reinforced her dual nature as a goddess who could both nurture and destroy, depending on the circumstances. In Egyptian temples, Hathor was often depicted as a cow or a cow-headed woman, and her worshippers honored her through music, song, and dance. The goddess's role as a lady of the West also connected her to the realm of the dead, as the western horizon was believed to be the gateway to the afterlife. In this context, Hathor's nurturing qualities were particularly significant. She was seen as a comforting and protective figure who could offer solace to the deceased and guide them to the perilous journey to the other side. Her association with the afterlife and death was balanced by her role in life as a goddess of fertility, joy, and love. This balance of life and death, creation and destruction, was a key theme in Egyptian religion and reflected the belief that all aspects of existence were interconnected. In the mythological tales of Hathor's wrath, her transformation into Sekhmet, a lioness-headed goddess of war and destruction, was one of the most striking examples of her dual nature. In one version of the myth, Hathor's fury was so great that she nearly wiped out all humanity. It was only through the intervention of Ra and the use of a powerful, intoxicating drink that she was pacified and returned to her gentle, loving form. This story reflects the ancient Egyptians' understanding of the unpredictable forces of nature and the gods. Hathor's rage, much like the storms and floods of the Nile, could bring devastation, but it could also be harnessed for good. The Egyptians recognized that the gods were not simple figures of benevolence. They were complex beings whose moods and actions could influence the world in both constructive and destructive ways. Ultimately, Hathor embodied the essential truth that life and death, creation and destruction, are two sides of the same coin. She was a goddess who could bring about both the greatest joys and the most terrible wrath, depending on the needs of the world and the will of the gods. Her dual nature speaks to the deep complexity of Egyptian thought, where the gods were not merely forces of good or evil, but agents of balance, constantly shifting between creation and destruction to maintain the harmony of the cosmos. Hathor, in her full and terrifying beauty, reminded the Egyptians of the ever-present tension between life and death, the known and the unknown, the nurturing and the destructive. Her mythology encapsulated a profound understanding that these forces, while seemingly opposed, were ultimately inseparable, and it was through their constant interplay that the world and the afterlife were kept in balance. In the vast tapestry of Egyptian mythology, where gods, creatures, and powerful forces intermingled to govern the world of the living and the dead, one figure stands as both an enigma and a key protector of the sacred order: Anubis, the god of mummification and protector of graves. As one of the most significant deities in the Egyptian pantheon, Anubis represented the mystery of death, the necessity of ritual, and the transition from life to the afterlife. His realm was neither fully mortal nor entirely divine. He existed at the threshold between the living and the dead, serving as a guide and guardian of souls. Anubis was the one who ensured that the journey from life into the underworld, the Duat, was conducted with care, dignity, and the proper rituals that were essential for a soul's safe passage to eternity. Anubis was commonly depicted as a man with the head of a jackal, a symbol that connected him both to the animal kingdom and the mysterious world of the dead. The jackal, known for its association with graveyards and scavenging, was a fitting creature for Anubis. It roamed the edges of the human world, much like Anubis himself, who was believed to guard the boundary between life and death. Jackals were often seen near burial sites in ancient Egypt, and their nocturnal habits and ability to wander between the known and unknown realms gave them an air of both reverence and fear. Anubis, through his connection to this animal, became the god who presided over death and burial rites, overseeing the very act that allowed the soul to pass from one world into the next. His role in the mummification process was central to belief in immortality, for through his guidance and protection, the soul was preserved and could embark on its journey toward the afterlife. In ancient Egyptian belief, death was not viewed as an end, but rather as a continuation of life in another form. The soul's journey to the afterlife was a fundamental part of Egyptian cosmology. Anubis' involvement in this journey was critical. As the god of mummification, he was entrusted with ensuring that the body was preserved so that the soul could recognize it in the afterlife. In a culture that placed great emphasis on the preservation of the body for the soul's benefit, mummification was seen as the key to eternal life. Anubis was said to have created the first mummification process, an act that was performed by priests and embalming specialists in his name. Through the careful ritual of embalming and wrapping, the body was preserved for eternity, enabling the soul to live on in the afterlife. The preservation of the body was, in essence, an act of love and care for the deceased, an offering to the gods that would ensure their eternal rest in the underworld. Anubis' role extended far beyond the act of mummification itself. He was also responsible for overseeing the weighing of the heart, one of the most important rituals in the Egyptian judgment process. The weighing of the heart took place in the Hall of Two Truths, where the deceased was brought before the judgment seat of Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Here, Anubis played a pivotal role as the guide to the deceased, leading them through the process. The heart of the deceased was placed on a scale and weighed against a feather of Ammit, the goddess of truth and justice. The heart, symbolizing the individual's moral character, had to balance perfectly with the feather to show that the deceased had lived a life in accordance with divine order and justice. If the heart was found to be heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Ammit, the monstrous devourer of souls, and the individual would cease to exist. Anubis, in his role as both guide and protector, ensured that the process was conducted with fairness, offering the deceased comfort as they faced this final judgment. His presence at this crucial moment was both a reassurance and a reminder that the transition between life and death was not one that should be taken lightly. It was a sacred process guided by divine hands. Anubis' involvement in the judgment of the soul is a reflection of the ancient Egyptian understanding of justice and moral order. Life on earth was governed by Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. This order was believed to extend beyond death, and Anubis, as the god who oversaw the mummification process and the judgment of souls, was seen as a keeper of this divine balance. His role in the weighing of the heart was not just to ensure that the soul passed through to the afterlife, but also to safeguard the truth and integrity of the process. The judgment of the soul was a moment of great significance, and Anubis, with his jackal form, stood as a vigilant protector of both the soul and the cosmic order that governed life and death. Anubis' association with death and mummification also placed him at the center of funerary rituals. He was invoked by mourners during the preparation of the body, ensuring that the deceased was treated with the respect and reverence they deserved. His connection to the afterlife made him a key figure in the preservation of the individual's legacy. In tombs, depictions of Anubis were often found alongside images of the deceased, symbolizing his role in guarding the tomb and ensuring the safe passage of the soul. His presence in the tomb was also a reminder of the impermanence of life and the inevitability of death. As much as Anubis represented the protection and guidance of the soul, he was also a stark reminder that all things must eventually come to an end. Yet, his role as protector ensured that death was not the end but a transition to another form of existence, one that was eternal if the proper rituals were observed. While Anubis was often seen as a god of death and funerary rites, he was not a god of destruction. Unlike other gods who represented chaos and destruction, such as Set, Anubis' function was to protect and guide the deceased, ensuring that their journey was as smooth and respectful as possible. His role was one of calm and careful attention, providing comfort to the souls of the dead as they made their way through the afterlife. His association with the jackal, an animal often seen scavenging around tombs, reinforced his role as a god who dealt with the physical remains of the deceased, ensuring their protection and preservation. Yet, despite his association with death, Anubis was not a deity that inspired fear in the way other gods did. His role was not to destroy or punish, but to guide, protect, and ensure the safe transition from life to death. Anubis was also a god who had a significant connection to pharaohs. The pharaoh, as both a king and a divine figure, was believed to be protected by Anubis in death. The ruler's body was meticulously mummified and prepared for burial, and the rituals associated with the pharaoh's death were performed with the utmost care and reverence. In the tombs of the pharaohs, Anubis was often depicted as standing guard, ensuring that the royal soul made its way safely to the afterlife. His protection was seen as essential to the eternal life of the pharaoh, who was believed to become a divine being after death. The pharaoh's mummification, along with the rituals that accompanied it, was thought to be a means of ensuring the ruler's immortality and continued power in the afterlife. Anubis, as a god of mummification, was seen as the key figure in this process, overseeing the preservation of the body and the safe transition of the soul to the realm of the gods. Over time, Anubis' role expanded beyond the realm of the dead and the funerary practices. As the god who bridged the worlds of the living and the dead, he became an important figure in the mythology of resurrection and rebirth. His connection to Osiris, the god of life, death, and rebirth, was central to this transformation. In many myths, Anubis was said to have helped Osiris in his journey after death, ensuring that the god's body was properly embalmed and preserved for resurrection. This connection reinforced Anubis' role as a deity who was not only concerned with death, but also with the rebirth and renewal that followed. The preservation of the body, through Anubis' guidance, was seen as a first step in the process of resurrection, symbolizing the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth that was fundamental to Egyptian belief. Anubis was a figure who occupied a space of great reverence and mystery. While he was a god of death, he was also a god of protection and guidance, ensuring that souls made their way to the afterlife with dignity and respect. His role in the mummification process, in the judgment of the soul, and in the protection of the dead made him an essential deity in the Egyptian pantheon. Through Anubis, the ancient Egyptians found a way to navigate the unknown, to understand the mystery of death, and to ensure that the soul's journey was one of balance, care, and protection. In his presence, death was not feared, but rather respected as a natural and necessary part of the cycle of life. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, the forces of life, death, and the afterlife were intricately woven together, with gods and mythical creatures playing an essential role in shaping the spiritual destiny of every soul. One such entity, whose presence in Egyptian mythology evokes both reverence and dread, is Ammit, the Devourer of souls. Ammit, a terrifying combination of crocodile, lioness, and hippopotamus, represented one of the most feared figures in the Egyptian underworld. Her role in the afterlife, though brief, was pivotal, and she was integral to the process of judgment, where the fate of the deceased was determined. In the minds of the ancient Egyptians, Ammit symbolized the harsh realities of divine justice, the consequences of immorality, and the terrifying possibility of eternal oblivion. Ammit's role in Egyptian mythology was primarily associated with the judgment of the soul. As a devourer, she was a final consequence for those whose hearts were found wanting during the weighing of the heart ceremony, an essential part of the soul's journey in the afterlife. The ceremony took place in the Hall of Two Truths, where the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Ma'at was the embodiment of balance, and the feather symbolized the purity and righteousness that every soul had uphold to pass into the afterlife. The heart, representing the essence of the person's life and moral character, had to be light and free from sin in order for the soul to succeed in the afterlife. However, if the heart was heavy with wrongdoings, greed, betrayal, deceit, and other immoral acts, it would tip the scales, signaling that the deceased was unworthy of entry into the eternal realm of the gods. At this moment, Ammit's role would come into play. If the deceased's heart was judged to be impure, Ammit would be called upon to devour the soul. This act was not a punishment in the traditional sense, but a final, irreversible destruction. Rather than sending the soul to suffer eternally in a realm of torment, Ammit's consumption meant that the soul would cease to exist altogether. The consequence of failing the judgment was not a simple punishment, but the complete annihilation of the individual's spiritual essence. The idea of being devoured by Ammit was one of the most terrifying fates imaginable in ancient Egyptian belief, as it represented total and utter obliteration, a fate worse than death itself. Ammit was depicted in a particularly fearsome way to reflect her role as a creature of destruction and annihilation. Her form was a grotesque amalgamation of the most dangerous and feared creatures in ancient Egypt. She had the head of a crocodile, the front of a lioness, and the back of a hippopotamus, combining the characteristics of three creatures known for their terrifying power. The crocodile, associated with the Nile, represented water, the force of chaos, and the destructive power of nature. The lioness, as a symbol of strength and ferocity, reinforced Ammit's role as a formidable force of justice and destruction. The hippopotamus, a creature that could be both gentle and dangerously territorial, added another layer of threat, symbolizing the uncontrollable and unpredictable nature of divine retribution. This monstrous fusion of animals perfectly encapsulated the god's terrifying power. She was a creature capable of swallowing the souls of the wicked, rendering them forever lost. In Egyptian society, The idea of judgment after death was not just a religious doctrine, but a vital part of daily life. The concept of Ma'at balance and cosmic order governed everything, from the pharaoh's rule to the most mundane aspects of social life. Every individual was expected to live in accordance with Ma'at, adhering to the principles of truth, justice, and harmony. The judgment process in the afterlife, with Ammit playing her crucial role, was an extension of this philosophy. The ancient Egyptians believed that death was not the end of a person's existence, but a transition into a different realm. The soul's journey through the Duat, the underworld, was fraught with challenges, trials, and obstacles, all designed to test the soul's worthiness for eternity. In this context, Ammit's role was to serve as a final measure of whether the deceased had upheld the principles of Ma'at in life. Her presence was a reminder that there were consequences for immorality, a stark warning that one's actions in life would determine their fate after death. The judgment of the heart and the potential for it to be devoured by Ammit emphasized the importance of living a righteous life. It was not enough to simply perform rituals or pay homage to the gods. One's heart had to be pure and just. The Egyptians believed that only those who had lived in alignment with Ma'at could successfully pass through the judgment, while those who had deviated from this path faced the ultimate fate of eternal annihilation at the hands of Ammit. The concept of annihilation through Ammit also reflected the Egyptians' complex view of the afterlife. While some cultures believe in eternal torment for the wicked, the Egyptians took a different approach. To be devoured by Ammit was not to be condemned to endless suffering, but to be erased from existence entirely. The soul was destroyed, and there was no hope of resurrection or rebirth. This fate was considered the most terrible one imaginable because it meant that the person's essence, their very soul, would be lost in the universe forever. The Egyptians viewed death as a passage to another life, where the soul would continue to exist in some form, either in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, or in the divine presence of the gods. To be consumed by Ammit was to be denied this continuation, to be reduced to nothingness. In this way, Ammit represented the ultimate negation of the individual, the complete severing of their connection to life, memory, and the divine order. Interestingly, while Ammit was a figure of great fear, she was not seen as an entirely malevolent being. She was a part of the cosmic order, fulfilling her role as the enforcer of divine justice. In Egyptian mythology, the gods were not bound by moral codes in the same way humans were. Their actions were governed by the necessity to maintain balance and order. Ammit's role in the judgment process was essential for upholding the principles of Ma'at, ensuring that the souls of those who had violated the natural and moral order did not disturb the balance of the afterlife. She was not a creature of petty vengeance, but rather a divine agent who ensured that justice was served, even if it meant the total destruction of a soul. Ammit's existence also served as a counterbalance to the more optimistic views of the afterlife held by the Egyptians. While many of the gods, including Osiris, Isis, and Horus, were associated with life, resurrection, and eternal peace, Ammit represented the other side of the coin, the consequences of a life lived in defiance of divine law. Her presence in the afterlife was a reminder that, for all the hope of eternal life, there were also dire consequences for those who lived unjustly. The Egyptians' belief in an afterlife was predicated on the idea of moral responsibility. To enter the realm of the gods, the soul had to prove its worth. Ammit was the final arbiter in this process, ensuring that the balance between life and death was maintained. In the broader context of Egyptian religion, Ammit's function also reflected the society's reverence for balance and order. The Egyptians did not see the world in terms of absolute good and evil, but as a constant striving for equilibrium. The gods, while powerful and divine, were not exempt from the need to maintain balance. In this sense, Ammit's role as a devourer was as much a part of the divine process as the life-giving acts of Osiris or the protective actions of Anubis. She ensured that only those who had lived according to the cosmic laws would continue their existence in the afterlife. In doing so, she helped preserve the integrity of the universe, making sure that the forces of chaos did not overtake the forces of order. Ammit's terrifying image, with her fearsome combination of the crocodile, lioness, and hippopotamus, became a powerful symbol of divine justice and the severe consequences of immorality. Her role in Egyptian mythology was to remind both the living and the dead that all actions had consequences. Her presence in the afterlife signified that, in the cosmic balance of the universe, there were no exceptions. The gods could be merciful, but they could also be just, and in the case of Ammit, that justice was absolute. The devouring of the heart by Ammit was the ultimate penalty, a fate that ensured the soul would never again be part of the eternal cycle of life and death. Through her, the ancient Egyptians underscored their belief in the importance of living a life in accordance with Ma'at, for in the afterlife, there would be no hiding from the truth. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the journey to the afterlife was fraught with danger, tests, and divine intervention. Central to this journey were the gods and goddesses that oversaw the passage of souls, ensuring that the laws of Ma'at, balanced truth and justice, were upheld. Among these deities, one stood out as both a protector and a guide to the perilous realms of the underworld, Osiris. As the god of the afterlife, resurrection, and regeneration, Osiris' role in the Egyptian pantheon was multifaceted, embodying the very cycle of life, death, and rebirth that governed not only the human experience but the natural world as well. His myth was foundational to Egyptian religious thought, and his influence extended far beyond the tombs of kings to the lives of everyday Egyptians. Osiris, traditionally depicted as a mummified king with a crown and scepter, symbolized a divine ruler who governed over the realm of the dead and offered hope for eternal life. He was a god who welcomed the deceased into the afterlife, judging their deeds during their lives and offering them a place in the field of reeds, a paradise where they could live in peace for eternity. Osiris' story was not one of mere immortality. It was a tale that represented the deep connection between the cycles of nature and the human soul. It was a story of suffering, death, and resurrection that mirrored the very seasons of the Nile River, the annual flooding that brought both destruction and life to Egypt. Osiris' myth was complex, and at its heart lay the idea of transformation and renewal. According to the most widely known version of his myth, Osiris was once a living king of Egypt, beloved by his people for his wisdom, justice, and benevolence. His rule brought prosperity to the land, and the people celebrated him as a god of fertility, agriculture, and growth. Yet, Osiris' brother Set, the god of chaos, jealousy, and destruction, harbored deep resentment toward him. Driven by envy of Osiris' popularity and the stability he brought to Egypt, Set devised a plan to rid himself of his brother and take the throne for himself. Set's scheme unfolded in a manner that would become one of the most iconic stories in Egyptian mythology. During a grand feast, Set presented a beautiful, intricately crafted coffin to Osiris, claiming that it would fit no one but him. Osiris, ever the trusting and generous ruler, climbed into the coffin to try it for size. As soon as Osiris lay within it, Set and his followers slammed the lid shut and sealed it, trapping Osiris inside. They then threw the coffin into the Nile River, where it was carried away to the sea, and Osiris' body was lost to the world. The coffin eventually came to rest in the city of Byblos, where it was encased in the trunk of a tree, which grew around it, trapping Osiris' body inside. When his wife, Isis, learned of her husband's death, she embarked on a tireless search to find his body. Isis' devotion and determination were legendary. She traveled far and wide, seeking the remains of her beloved Osiris. Eventually, after much hardship, she discovered a tree that encased his body and retrieved it. But Set, ever the destroyer, found out what had happened and, in a fit of rage, dismembered Osiris' body into pieces, scattering them across Egypt. Isis, with the help of her sister Nephthys and other deities, once again searched for the pieces of her husband's body and reassembled them. She performed the necessary rituals to revive Osiris, but the god could never fully return to the land of the living. Instead, Osiris became the ruler of the afterlife, the lord of the dead, who governed the realm of the deceased and ensured that the souls of the departed could live again in the afterlife. The resurrection of Osiris was not only a divine act, but a symbol of hope and continuity for the Egyptian people. It embodied the idea that death was not the end, but a necessary step in the eternal cycle of life. In Osiris, the Egyptians saw the eternal cycle of nature itself. The flooding and receding of the Nile, the death and rebirth of crops, and the promise of resurrection after death. Through Osiris' resurrection, the ancient Egyptians found solace in the belief that death was not final. As Osiris had been reborn, so too could they hope for their own rebirth in the afterlife. Osiris' influence extended far beyond the myths that told of his death and resurrection. He became the central figure in the Egyptian concept of the afterlife. He was the one who welcomed the souls of the deceased into the underworld, the Duat, where they would undergo the weighing of the heart. This process was the ultimate test of the deceased, in which their heart was weighed against a feather of Ma'at, to determine their worthiness. Those who pass the test would be granted eternal life in the field of reeds, while those who fail would face annihilation at the hands of Ammit, the Devourer of souls. Osiris, as the god of the afterlife, was also associated with the idea of judgment. He represented divine justice, ensuring that those who lived righteous lives were rewarded with peace and comfort in the afterlife, while those who lived in dishonesty or cruelty were condemned to nothingness. His role in the weighing of the heart emphasized the importance of moral integrity, both in life and after death. In many depictions, Osiris was shown seated on a throne, surrounded by the gods who help in the judgment process, including Anubis, the god of mummification and embalming, who guided the deceased through the trials of the do-it. In the temples and tombs of Egypt, Osiris was frequently depicted as a mummified figure, wearing a crown and holding the scepter of kingship. This portrayal symbolized both his role as a ruler of the dead and his connection to the earthly world. Osiris was not simply a deity of death, but a divine figure who connected the realms of the living and the dead, offering a pathway for the soul to transition from one state to another. His resurrection was not just a personal transformation, but a cosmic event that ensured the cyclical nature of life and death would continue, both for the gods and for humans. Osiris' role in Egyptian religious practices was further emphasized by the festivals dedicated to him. The most significant of these was the annual Osiris Mysteries, a series of rites and rituals held to honor Osiris and celebrate his death and resurrection. These mysteries were celebrated with great fervor in many parts of Egypt, especially in the city of Abydos, which was considered Osiris' spiritual home. Pilgrims would travel to Abydos to participate in the rituals, which included offerings to Osiris, processions, and reenactments of his death and resurrection. These rituals were believed to ensure that the cycle of life and death continued in harmony and that Osiris' power would protect the living and guide the souls of the dead. The myth of Osiris also influenced Egyptian kingship. The pharaohs were often identified with Osiris, and their death and burial were seen as a reflection of Osiris' own journey. Like Osiris, the pharaoh would die, but through the rituals performed at his tomb, he would be reborn in the afterlife, where he would continue to rule over Egypt. The connection between Osiris and the pharaohs reinforced the belief that the king was not just a political leader, but also a divine figure, chosen by the gods to maintain order and justice on earth. The pharaoh's death was viewed as a necessary part of the cosmic cycle, and his resurrection ensured that Egypt would continue to thrive under divine protection. Osiris myth also influenced other aspects of Egyptian culture, from art and architecture to funerary practices. In tombs, Osiris was often depicted as a mummified figure, symbolizing both the death of the individual and the promise of life after death. Statues of Osiris were placed in tombs to ensure that the deceased would be protected and guided on their journey through the afterlife. The idea of resurrection was central to Egyptian religious thought, and Osiris, as the god who made this possible, became the focal point of their spiritual hopes and beliefs. While Osiris was deeply connected to the afterlife, his myth also had profound implications for the living. The story of his death and resurrection symbolized the cyclical nature of life itself, the inevitable process of birth, death, and rebirth. Just as Osiris died and was reborn, so too did the people of Egypt see the seasons of nature, the growth of crops, and the annual flooding of the Nile. These natural cycles were seen as reflections of the divine cycle of life and death, and Osiris, as the god who embodied this process, was revered as a figure of eternal hope and renewal. Osiris myth also reflected the Egyptian understanding of the relationship between the divine and the human. While Osiris was a god of the afterlife, he was also a figure who represented human qualities: love, devotion, suffering, and rebirth. His resurrection was not just a divine act, but a symbol of the potential for spiritual transformation. For the ancient Egyptians, Osiris was more than a god. He was a representation of the eternal cycle that governed both the natural world and the human soul. Through his myth, the Egyptians found comfort in the belief that death was not the end, but merely a passage to another life, a life that was eternal and full of possibility. In every aspect of Egyptian life, Osiris' influence was felt, from the tombs of the pharaohs to the rituals of daily life. His power was a constant presence, ensuring that the cycles of life, death, and Reb in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Few deities were as intimately tied to both life and death as the goddess Isis. She was revered as a multifaceted figure, one whose influence stretched across all aspects of Egyptian existence. Isis' significance went beyond her maternal and nurturing qualities, embodying wisdom, magic, healing, and protection, making her one of the most powerful and beloved deities in ancient Egypt. Her myths were central to Egyptian religious practices and their views on the afterlife, for it was through her compassion and resilience that the world found balance in the face of death, chaos, and suffering. Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris, was known for her deep devotion and love for her family, especially for her brother-husband, Osiris. The story of their love and the trials they faced together is one of the most famous in Egyptian mythology. As Osiris' consort, Isis represented the perfect model of wife and mother, deeply committed to both her husband and their child, Horus. Yet, her role was not confined to domestic life. Isis was a goddess of immense power, and her magic was considered the most potent in the world. She possessed the ability to heal, to protect, and to aid in the restoration of life, making her a figure of both compassion and strength. One of the most important myths in Egyptian mythology is the story of Isis' role in the resurrection of Osiris. After Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, the god of chaos and destruction, Isis' love for her husband propelled her to search for his dismembered body. In her grief, Isis demonstrated an unwavering determination to restore Osiris to life. This act of devotion and perseverance became a symbol of the unbreakable bond of family, and the lengths one would go to protect those they love. Isis' search for Osiris took her across Egypt, where she found and reassembled his body. She used her magical powers to bring Osiris back to life, but not to the land of the living. Osiris could never fully return to his mortal form. Instead, through her magic, Osiris became the ruler of the afterlife, governing the realm of the dead, a powerful symbol of resurrection and the eternal cycle of life and death. The resurrection of Osiris was not only a tale of love and devotion, but also an essential part of the Egyptian understanding of life's cyclical nature. Through the act of bringing Osiris back to life, Isis played a crucial role in ensuring the continued prosperity of Egypt and the stability of the natural world. Osiris' resurrection, facilitated by Isis, symbolized the renewal of the seasons, the flooding of the Nile, and the rebirth of crops that was so vital to Egyptian agriculture. In this sense, Isis was not just a goddess of mourning, but a goddess of hope, restoration, and continuity. But Isis' role was not just limited to the resurrection of Osiris. She was also seen as protector and a healer. Her magic was renowned, and she was often invoked by the Egyptians for her ability to cure diseases, alleviate suffering, and ensure the protection of both the living and the dead. Isis was considered the embodiment of divine wisdom, and her magical powers were thought to be capable of altering the course of fate itself. She was often called upon by the living for aid in times of crisis, whether it was to protect against illness, to ensure the safety of loved ones, or to provide guidance through difficult decisions. In addition to her protective qualities, Isis was also associated with maternal love and nurturing. She was a mother of Horus, the child of Osiris, and her devotion to him became a central part of her identity. As a mother, Isis was seen as the archetype of maternal care, always protecting her son and ensuring his safety, particularly after Osiris' death. Horus struggled to avenge his father's death and reclaim his rightful place, as king was one of the central themes in Egyptian mythology, and Isis played a critical role in aiding him throughout his trials. She used her magic to heal him, to guide him, and protect him from the threats posed by Set, Osiris' jealous brother. Isis' love for Horus was a powerful force in the mythological narrative, showing that her role as a mother was just as important as her role as a wife, sister, and goddess of magic. Her protective nature extended beyond her immediate family. Isis was also considered a guardian of the Egyptian people, ensuring their safety and prosperity. She was seen as a deity who could ward off evil and protect Egypt from invasion, pestilence, and misfortune. Temples to Isis were built throughout Egypt, and her worship was widespread, with offerings made to her to ensure her continued favor and protection. She was particularly revered in times of war, and many believed that invoking her name would bring victory to the Egyptian armies. The goddess was not only a figure of divine love, but also a symbol of strength, courage, and endurance in the face of hardship. Isis' importance extended well beyond the borders of Egypt, and her influence was felt throughout the ancient world. Over time, her worship spread to neighboring regions, and she became one of the most widely venerated deities in the Mediterranean world. The Greeks, in particular, adopted Isis into their own pantheon, identifying her with their goddess Demeter, and the Romans, too, embrace her as a goddess of healing, magic, and protection. This spread of her cult was indicative of the universal appeal of her qualities. Her love, wisdom, and power transcended the boundaries of culture and geography, making her a goddess of both personal and collective importance. In the temples dedicated to Isis, she was often depicted in her many forms. Sometimes she was shown as a woman with a throne-shaped crown, symbolizing her role as a queen and ruler of the divine realm. Other times, she was shown as a mother, holding her son Horus in her arms, embodying the archetype of maternal love and care. In some depictions, she was represented with the wings of a bird, which symbolized her protective nature and her ability to embrace and shield her worshippers. Her iconography varied, but at the core of her image was her nurturing, protective, and magical essence. Isis' influence was also significant in the realm of funerary practices. As a goddess who helped resurrect Osiris, she was often invoked in burial rituals and tomb paintings. It was believed that by calling upon Isis' powers, the deceased would receive her protection and guidance in the afterlife. She was often depicted in tombs, offering the deceased a safe passage through the underworld, much as she had done for Osiris. Isis' role in funerary practices reflected her dual nature as both a goddess of life and a goddess of death, as she was seen as one who ensured the transition from life to the afterlife was as peaceful and secure as possible. Isis' association with the underworld was not as direct as that of Osiris or Anubis, but she was deeply involved in the spiritual transition from life to death. Her role as protector of the dead meant that she was invoked to guard the soul as it passed through the trials of the afterlife. The deceased would seek her favor, hoping for her protection as they journeyed to the Egyptian underworld, where they would be judged and weighed. Her influence ensured that the deceased would face no harm, and that their soul would find peace and renewal in the afterlife. The worship of Isis was deeply intertwined with the natural world. As a goddess associated with fertility, magic, and healing, she was closely linked to the cycles of nature, particularly the flooding of the Nile. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, was seen as a divine gift, and the annual flooding was believed to be a manifestation of the goddess's power. The fertility that followed the flood was associated with Isis' ability to bring life and abundance. Her blessings were thought to ensure that the land was fertile, that crops would grow, and that the people would prosper. In this way, Isis was not just a goddess of the afterlife, but also a goddess who directly influenced the material world, ensuring the sustenance of Egypt's economy and the well-being of its people. As time passed, the image of Isis continued to evolve. While she began as a local deity in the Nile Delta, her influence spread far and wide, as she became a symbol of universal motherhood, magic, and wisdom. The temples of Isis, which once dotted the banks of the Nile, were replicated in far-flung corners of the Mediterranean and beyond. The most famous of these temples was the Temple of Isis at Philae, located on an island in the Nile. This temple, which became a major center of Isis worship, was not only a place of religious devotion, but also a place of healing, where the goddess' power was invoked to cure diseases and alleviate suffering. Even after the decline of ancient Egyptian civilization, the worship of Isis persisted, continuing in various forms through the Roman and early Christian periods. Isis' myth, her powers, and her nurturing qualities made her one of the most enduring symbols of ancient Egypt. Her love for Osiris, her devotion to Horus, and her role as a protector of the living and the dead ensured that she would be venerated for centuries. Isis embodied the ideal of divine compassion and strength, the perfect balance between gentleness and power. In every aspect of life, from the mundane to the mystical, Isis was present, and her influence continued to shape the spiritual and cultural landscape of Egypt and the broader ancient world. Isis represented the eternal mother, the powerful sorceress, the healer, and the protector, qualities that transcended time and space. She was not only a goddess of ancient Egypt, but a universal symbol of connection between the divine and human experience, illustrating a profound relationship between love, magic, and the mysteries of life and death. The ancient Egyptian world was populated by a vast array of gods and mythical creatures, each embodying different aspects of life, death, and the cosmos. Yet, none were as intricately linked to the forces of chaos and disorder as Set, the god of destruction, storms, and chaos. A deity whose role in Egyptian mythology was both feared and revered, Set's influence in the Egyptian pantheon was undeniable. His complex character was shaped by his fierce nature, his constant battle with other gods, and his eventual fall from grace as the quintessential symbol of disorder in the world. Set, often depicted as a man with the head of an unknown animal, sometimes referred to as the Set animal or Typhonian beast, was a deity whose very form was a symbol of his chaotic nature. His appearance was distinctive, marked by a long, curved snout, square ears, and a long, straight tail, features that set him apart from all other gods. Unlike other animal-headed gods, Set's animal form did not resemble any known creature in the Egyptian environment, which made him all the more unsettling. This strange and unique depiction of Set reflected his nature. He was a god who did not fit into the orderly, structured world of Egypt, just as the forces he represented were disruptive and unsettling. Set was one of the oldest deities in the Egyptian pantheon, and in his earliest representations, he was not seen solely as an embodiment of evil, but rather as a god of strength, power, and protection. In these early myths, Set was considered a vital figure who helped maintain the balance of nature. He was associated with the desert, the storms, and the unpredictability of life, all of which were seen as necessary components of the natural world. The desert, while a harsh and unforgiving place, was also a source of life and resources for the ancient Egyptians. It was a home of precious minerals, and it was from the desert that the Egyptians obtained some of their most valued goods. Set was a god of this realm, and his powers were seen as essential to the functioning of the world. However, over time, Set's role shifted. As Egyptian mythology became more structured and the gods were given more defined roles within the cosmic order, Set's association with chaos and disorder began to dominate his character. His fierce rivalry with Osiris, the god of life and death, marked the beginning of his fall from grace. The myth of Osiris and Set's role in his death is one of the most significant in Egyptian mythology and offers a window into the nature of Set's character and his eventual transformation into the god of destruction. Set's envy of his brother Osiris was a pivotal moment in Egyptian mythology. Osiris, the god of fertility, agriculture, and resurrection, was beloved by the people and revered as the king of Egypt. He brought order, prosperity, and life to the land. Set, on the other hand, was associated with the harsh, untamable forces of the desert and chaos. As Osiris became the ruler of Egypt, Set grew jealous of his brother's popularity and power. This jealousy soon turned to hatred, and Set plotted to rid himself of Osiris and take the throne for himself. He devised a cunning plan, presenting Osiris with a beautifully crafted coffin and tricking him into lying inside. Once Osiris entered the coffin, Set and his followers sealed it shut and cast it into the Nile River, where it was carried away. Set's role in the murder of Osiris marked him as the ultimate antagonist in Egyptian mythology. However, his actions were not merely the result of personal ambition. They symbolized the forces of disorder and destruction that sought to disrupt the natural harmony of the world. In ancient Egyptian thought, the cosmos was maintained by the balance between opposing forces, order and chaos, life and death, light and dark. Set represented the destructive, chaotic force that threatened to undo this balance. His hatred of Osiris and his subsequent murder were symbolic of the constant struggle between these opposing forces. Osiris' death, followed by his resurrection at the hands of his wife, Isis, and the eventual triumph of their son, Horus, over Set, reinforced the idea that while chaos and destruction were ever present in the world, they were ultimately overcome by the forces of order and renewal. Despite Set's role as the antagonist in the myth of Osiris, his character was not solely defined by evil. In fact, Set had a dual nature, and his actions were often a reflection of the complex interplay between creation and destruction in the world. As the god of storms in the desert, Set was also seen as a protector of Egypt, guarding the land from the encroaching forces of chaos. Storms, while often violent and dangerous, were also essential for the fertilization of the land. Set's role in the natural world was therefore paradoxical. On one hand, he represented the destructive forces of nature, but on the other hand, he was also seen as a necessary force that could be harnessed for good. Set's association with storms in the desert also made him a god of extremes. He was a deity who represented the power of nature in its rawest form. The desert was both a place of desolation and a source of life, as the Egyptians relied on the desert for minerals and precious stones. Storms, too, could be both destructive and regenerative, as they brought much-needed rain to the land. Set's role in the Egyptian pantheon was, therefore, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life and the constant presence of both creation and destruction in the natural world. His powers were awe-inspiring, but they were also uncontrollable and dangerous. The rivalry between Set and Horus, Osiris' son, was another defining feature of Set's character. After Osiris' death, Horus sought to avenge his father and reclaim the throne of Egypt. The battle between Horus and Set became legendary, representing the ongoing conflict between order and chaos, light and dark. Set, as the embodiment of chaos and destruction, fought fiercely against Horus, but in the end, Horus triumphed, restoring balance to the world and securing his place as the rightful ruler of Egypt. Despite his defeat, Set's role in the mythological narrative was far from over. While Horus emerged victorious, Set was not completely destroyed. His presence in the mythological tradition continued to serve as a reminder that chaos, though temporarily subdued, was an ever-present force that could never be fully eradicated. Set's defeat by Horus did not mark the end of his influence. Despite being defeated in battle, Set continued to hold a significant place in Egyptian religious practices. His role as the god of chaos and disorder meant that he was often invoked in rituals related to protection and the warding off of evil. In Egyptian thought, the forces of chaos were not inherently evil. They were simply disruptive. As such, Set's power could be harnessed for protective purposes. He was invoked in times of conflict, particularly in military contexts, where his strength and power were seen as beneficial. Set was also associated with the protection of the pharaohs, and his name was invoked in curses against enemies and invaders. While Set was often seen as the embodiment of chaos, he was also a force that could be used to maintain balance and safeguard Egypt from external threats. The complex nature of Set's character was reflected in the ways he was worshipped and depicted in art. In some depictions, Set was shown as a god of strength and power, wielding a weapon and standing tall in battle. In others, he was shown as a more ambiguous figure, often in conflict with other gods, yet still holding place of importance in the divine hierarchy. Set was often associated with the colors red and green, which symbolized both chaos and regeneration. His connection to the desert and the storm was also represented in his iconography, with Set frequently being depicted as a god of storms, wielding the destructive forces of nature. Set's worship was widespread in ancient Egypt, particularly in the northern regions, where he was associated with the city of Avaris. Despite his connection to chaos and destruction, Set was seen as protector of Egypt, and his influence was felt in many aspects of Egyptian life, from military campaigns to religious practices. His role as the god of storms and chaos was not seen as inherently negative, but as a necessary part of the natural world, one that had to be respected and understood. Set's dual nature, as both a bringer of destruction and a protector, made him a complex and powerful figure in Egyptian mythology. Over time, Set's image began to change. As Egypt's religious landscape evolved, Set's role as a god of chaos became more pronounced, and his association with evil deepened. Set was often depicted as a figure of fear and dread, associated with the forces of disorder and destruction. His rivalry with Osiris and Horus became emblematic of the eternal struggle between good and evil, order and chaos. Despite his eventual fall from grace, Set remained a powerful figure in Egyptian mythology, embodying the forces of nature that could not be fully controlled or understood. The figure of Set represents much more than just chaos. He embodies the unpredictable forces of nature, the essential role of destruction in the process of creation, and the constant tension between opposing forces that defines the human experience. Set's mythology speaks to the complexity of the world, where light cannot exist without darkness and order cannot be established without chaos. Through his actions and his complex character, Set played an integral role in the maintenance of cosmic balance, ensuring that Egypt's gods and people understood the ever-present reality of conflict, change, and transformation.